Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight to this evening's Wild Spaces event. I'm Amelia Caddy, and before we begin I just want to take a moment for us all to acknowledge that we're gathered tonight on the homelands of the Kootenay people. As you can probably tell, I was not born here. I moved from Australia to Canada about 2 years ago. So for me, my first experience seeing a mountain goat is still pretty fresh in my mind. It was October last year. I just finished a rock climb called Joy on Mount Indefatigable in Kootenays country. And I topped out and I saw this kind of like shaggy white shape on the ridgeline opposite me. I'm short-sighted, so I couldn't really make out what it was. And I had never really even seen photos of mountain goats before. And I just sat there and I stared at it for about a minute, probably while my partner down below wondered what I was doing. And then I stood up and it immediately kind of melted into the rocks away from me. So it's kind of just like burnt into my memory, that experience. And as a rock climber, as an alpine climber, I have a lot of experiences like that where I'm in remote places and I run into wildlife, usually from afar, sometimes up close. And as a conservationist, as someone who cares about the world around me, I often find myself wondering if and how my presence in those places impacts the animals that are around me. And this series that we've been running called Wild Spaces, I guess it's WildSight's attempt to answer that question by bringing together experts, scientists, land managers, with the general public in rooms like this, and trying to break down some of the research that's out there, that's emerging around what those impacts are and what we as citizens can do to manage our impacts. So tonight, we're very privileged to have Kim and Amanda joining us. I'm going to let them introduce themselves very shortly. A couple of housekeeping things. For those who haven't been here before, probably all of you have, you walked past the toilets on the outside there. If you haven't already, can you please turn your phones onto silent mode? Thank you. I'm going to be filming this and we'll be posting the video afterwards. So if you want to go back and reference anything or share it with friends, you can do so. And we'll be aiming to have you out of here tonight by around 8:30. We'll do our best. Over to you guys.
Awesome. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Cold, dark, dreary night. So there's nothing better to do than come and listen to us talk about mountain goats for sure. Thank you so much to Amelia and Jenna and WildSight for giving us this opportunity to come and speak. We're super happy to be here with you on the traditional territory of the Kootenay and the Secwepemc. For those of you I don't know, my name is Amanda Weber-Roy, and I'm a biologist with BC Parks here in the Kootenays. I work out of our Cranbrook and Nelson offices, but I live right here in Kimberley.
Hi, my name's Kim Poole. I'm an independent wildlife biologist based in Nelson in the West Kootenays. I've been a wildlife biologist for many, many years. I've spent my first 15 years up based in Yellowknife, working for the territorial government back when the NWT was both NWT and Nunavut, as we know it now. But I arrived in the Kootenays in the late 1990s, and actually within, I think, weeks, if not a month, one of my first jobs was doing mountain goat surveys in the Slocan Valley. And since then, I've worked on mountain goats almost continuously, doing many radio calling projects, and doing assessments on habitat and various things, and spent many hundreds of hours in a helicopter surveying for them. So this species is a bit of a passion for me, so I greatly enjoy, and I'm very happy to be able to share this with you. Just one note is that the photos taken that we're showing tonight, they were taken either by BC Park staff or myself or my wife Louise, unless otherwise noted.
Great. So this evening, we're going to talk to you a little bit about, just really briefly, about visitor use trends and recreation ecology. We'll tell you a little bit about distribution and physiology of mountain goats. We'll talk about salt conditioning and habituation. There's been some recent research that's been done on mountain goats and their responses to recreation, so we'll tell you a little bit about that. We're going to spend quite a bit of our presentation talking about the Gimli Goat Project that Kim and I are working together on in Valhalla Park, and we'll compare and contrast that with a goat project that's happening at Cathedral Park. And then we'll talk a little bit about mountain goats in the winter, and then we'll summarize it all up with what you can do to help, and there'll be lots of time at the end for questions. And I've got some really cool BC Park stickers. If you ask questions, I'll give you one. So hopefully that's some good incentive. Okay, so everyone in this room is passionate about recreation, right? Yes, show of hands, we love it, right? It gives us these great warm fuzzy feelings. We all know the benefits we get from recreating in a really, really beautiful place. But I think it's no secret that recreation is exponentially increasing. We see it everywhere we go. We see it here in our little hometown, right? With the Electrify the mountain bike trails and our nature park getting busier, and it's really hard to find a spot to park at the Nordic Center on the weekend. Thank goodness they've got that camera so you can see at the parking lot so you know when to go. So yeah, things are getting busier and busier. And recreational demand is growing exponentially in park systems across Canada, but not just in park systems, it's growing on the general land base everywhere. And these next two bullets here are from the BC Parks website. So about 90% of British Columbians have used a provincial park at some point. And about 6 in 10 residents of British Columbia use a provincial park every year. And there's about 5 million of us in BC, and our population is also growing. So as land managers and park managers, these are the types of things that we begin to think about. Or like Amelia said in her example when she opened, as recreationalists, these are the things that we're starting to think about is, we know that how we use the landscape directly influences how wildlife use the landscape.
For those of you that were able to see Clayton Lamb's talk earlier this summer out of Fernie or seen it on the YouTube channel for WildSight, you would have known that recreational ecology is kind of an expanding field, but there are a lot of data gaps. Many people think that recreation is generally bad for wildlife, but that's not always the case. Clayton summarized that motorized recreation, and I think he was referring primarily to dirt bikes and ATVs, has more impact on the distribution of wildlife on the landscape, more so than mountain bikers and hikers. There is different data out there that suggests that animals react to hikers and mountain bikers to a large degree as well. Most of the responses, they can be variable. Often the animals shift their pattern of use of the landscape, shifting more to a nighttime use, or often they will either move away from an area or not return to the same area.
I recently read a quote that said that ecology is not rocket science, it's a lot harder. And I think that quote is really appropriate in this case.
So just to do a little bit of review on mountain goats, they're a species that's adapted to alpine, cold adapted species that inhabit the alpine habitats of Western North America. When people think of mountain goats, they often think of wild and pristine habitats. BC has about 50% of the world's mountain goat population, and the Kootenays have about 20% of BC's population. The animal's been very well surveyed over the last 3 decades, and this is just a smattering of a bazillion data points. And it is a harvested species, but the harvest is quite tightly regulated. So as I said, they occur in the mountainous habitat throughout the Kootenays, slightly higher densities in the Rocky Mountains and lower densities in the Purcells, and especially in the West Kootenays. As a predator avoidance strategy, mountain goats generally are either on or within 200, 300, 400 meters of escape terrain. And this is very steep, rocky terrain that they can move around on and get to forage. But predators have much more difficulty getting at. Mountain goats have very soft cups on the bottom of their feet. And if you've ever been lucky enough to see them walking on cliffs, it's incredible how little area they need to be able to move around on them. So a typical reaction from a naive mountain goat when they see a human is to see us as a threat and to flee and to avoid us. We are going to touch on winter range later in the talk, but as you can imagine, it's a time of much more restricted resources and restricted movement for these animals.
So goats require salt and other minerals to aid in digestion and their metabolic processes. And mineral licks is typically where they get these salt and minerals from. And usually those are naturally occurring mineral licks on the landscape. And you've probably seen these things if you're driving through Kootenay National Park or Jasper National Park, and you see that sandy slope and there's typically goats at the bottom. Actually, or this picture here is actually from St. Mary's. And so the goats ingest soil to obtain the supplemental minerals not found in their regular forage or diet. And so they'll do that to support the seasonal changes in their diet as they shift from a winter diet to a summer diet, because the consumption of salt really helps balance sodium in their diets. And salt is really important, but it's not always the main focus. They need calcium, magnesium, calcium carbonate. And many individuals will travel a really, really long distance to get these things. So there was a study that was done in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Parks where goats were traveling in excess of 30 kilometers in one direction to go to Canyon Creek to access a mineral lick there, and then coming back. And they were doing that twice a year. So that's a huge risk that a goat is taking to acquire what they need. And so there's increasing examples of mountain goats becoming tolerant of and attracted to human presence, mostly because it's related to this mineral acquisition.
So as I mentioned, there has been a number of research projects on mountain goat responses to recreation. Just to touch on some of them, Cathedral Provincial Park. I'm going to go into that in a little more detail later, but it's an area, and again, the photo on the top there at the right is from the park. You can see the goats are in amongst the tents in the campsite. So this is an area where you have increasing overlap from goats and humans, and these goats are actually using humans as a source of minerals, salt, and we'll get into more of that later. The opposite was seen in Jasper National Park, where they were expanding a ski area, and despite having adequate winter range within the ski area, these goats were avoiding the edges of the ski boundary. There was just too much activity. And then there's Olympic National Park. It's kind of a bit of it's a high profile thing. Goats are actually not native. So this is in the Olympic Peninsula, just south of Victoria. Goats were never native there, but I think in the 1940s, they introduced goats thinking, wow, they introduced animals everywhere back in those days. And the numbers expanded to well over 12 or 1,400 animals. But after a while, the parks people realized that these goats were changing the environment. They were basically eating the place out of house and home, because that's what goats tend to do. And they were also getting too interactive with humans. And it culminated in 2011 when a man who was hiking on a trail was gored by a billy mountain goat and actually died. In the intervening decade, national parks in the States thought about it a lot and did a lot of studies, basically decided to get rid of the animals because they were an invasive species. And through the process of capturing, moving, and a fair bit of shooting, I think as of 3 or 4 years ago, they've removed all of these goats from that area. The studies have shown that the social structure, the group size, and other factors affect how goats respond to recreation activities. Nannies with kids are generally more sensitive because the nanny is just more cognizant of the kid being vulnerable to people. One of the studies that's been done fairly close to here was done by Madeline Raze. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. She grew up in Invermere and just recently completed her master's working on recreation in Yoho and I think Kootenay or Banff National Park. And she found out that in very high human use areas, it kind of had minimal influence on the goats' diurnal patterns. In other words, they didn't shift their patterns of being active at dawn and dusk and during the day. But she did find that in areas of very high human use, that these animals were always closer to escape terrain. So in other words, that was affecting their habitat use or their distribution within the landscape. She also found that goats in these high human use areas had higher levels of cortisol, which are stress hormones, and these are determined from analysis of hair. So there are some not necessarily overt, but more subtle impacts of what recreation can do to mountain goats.
Okay, so show of hands. Do you know where Valhalla Provincial Park is? Awesome. Okay, most people do. Have you been to the Gimli campground and recreated there? Some people. Okay. Did you see goats when you were there, Becky? Yeah. Okay, awesome. So Gimli Ridge is a campground that BC Parks has in Valhalla Provincial Park over in the West Kootenay. The campsite is at 2,450 meters. It is spectacular. It's beautiful. You got to drive down a really crappy FSR to get there. But once you get there, it's 1.5 to 2 hours to hike in, and you get to be in a beautiful, spectacular place. And so the area is super popular. We've got some photos coming up to show you what is so popular about it. But there's climbing there, and there's so many climbers who go. Amelia, have you climbed there? Not yet. Okay. But I'm sure you will. It's probably on your list because it's often described as one of the best classic rock climbs in our region and maybe even the country. So tons of people go there to go climbing from all over the world. And also tons of day hikers go there. It's like I was saying, it's 1.5 to 2 hours to get into this spectacular place. And so people go there also for overnight camping opportunity as well. It got really, really busy during COVID. And so since about the late 1990s, goat numbers have steadily started to increase at the campsite. It started out with maybe 2 hanging around, and in the 2010s, there started to be some nannies and kids showing up, and by about the mid-2010s, there was 5 to 10 goats. And then we started doing counts in 2020, 2021, and there was 15 to 17. So the numbers have steadily been increasing, and we don't totally know the extent of the local population, but we think it could be between 25 and 30 goats. And it's not a wintering area, so they don't hang out here in the winter. They hang out here in the summer while the people are there. And these goats have become increasingly tolerant to people. They don't exhibit a typical behavior that Kim was just describing when you see people and they flee. It's actually the exact opposite of that. So they're displaying a significantly salt-conditioned behavior, and the main attraction appears to be from people, salt deposited by people in the form of urine.
So while these goats at Gimli, at least so far, can't be described as aggressive, they are pushy and they're bold. They will approach within actually 1 meter to 1.5 meters, and I'm trying not to exaggerate, but I've literally had a goat using the old system 4 feet away, so that's less than 1.5 meters. I've had experiences where I could get up out of my tent in the morning, walk to the edge of the ridge line just to go see the view, and you literally have a nanny running after you, sort of standing there looking at you saying, okay, yeah, do your thing. And because they want to eat the soil and get the salt out of it. The goats have also, they pursue hikers for sure, including going down the trail to meet them as they're coming up. And they also are a bit of a pain for the climbers. And the climbers have told us that they're a little bit worried because the goats have appeared to be aggressive. And they're also climbing above the people that are doing belay. So they're worried about rocks being knocked down because the goats want to get so close to people, and it's a bit of a dangerous situation. BC Parks conducted a number of questionnaires and surveys last year, and they found that while most people kind of think, yeah, the goats are cute, it's all nice and all that, some people are just not comfortable with a wild animal with very sharp pointing horns being so close to you. And we had quotes like, I just don't want to get out of the tent at night because I'm scared that they're going to be stalking me. That's you.
That's me. Yeah, so BC Parks has done some things, predominantly tried to manage the urine, and I will show you some photos coming up. So we installed a fully enclosed outhouse. We removed the open style garden throne. We installed a urinal at the base of the climb for the climbers to use, so a non-gender specific urinal that anyone can use. We really beefed up our public education. We put in new signs. We tried to increase our ranger presence and our student ranger presence to be able to give the public more information. We put a bunch of information on our website. And so this is what the garden throne looked like, because this is a toilet that used to be there. This has since been removed and been replaced with this typical toilet here. This is Gimli Ridge that we were talking about in the background. So this is where the climbers come from all over the world, quite obviously, to climb that, because it's really spectacular. And here's an example of what some of our new signage looks like in the park. So that's really telling people how to behave when they come to the park, and that they can see these goats are obviously there, but they're habituated, and here's the reasons why, and here's how you need to behave while you're there. And so despite research at both Cathedral Park and Gimli, despite our visitors being well informed, we assume that they're well informed, still 30 to 35% of people aren't using the facilities all the time, and that is specifically at night. So we know it's cold, we know it's dark, you got to put on your jacket, your toque, your headlamp, all these things. It sucks to have to walk to the outhouse at night, but not doing that is really what's perpetuating this problem. And so yeah, we did those, we tried to manage the urine, tried to do all those things, but still there was a significant issue happening. And we started to be concerned about the safety of the goats and the safety of our park visitors. So in 2020, with our license plate funding, we were able to hire Kim, thank goodness, with all this experience, who is able to do research and work with us to try and look at all the other options that were out there and tell us what might be applicable in a provincial park. And so what we did was in June of 2021, we collared 6 goats. So we collared 4 nannies and 2 billies. And this was really to try and gain a better understanding. Where are they moving to? When are they going there? So basically patterns of movement and their distribution on the landscape. And so this is independent of park visitors telling us where they've seen goats or where we held wildlife camera data. And so one goat did die, and that was of a suspected grizzly bear predation within the first year, or was it the second year? It was year 2.
It was year 2. Yeah.
It was year 2, yeah. But we, because these goats are so habituated, we went and collected that collar and immediately deployed it on another female. And so, yeah, like I said, we continued. So we did the collaring, but we also continued to do our public education. And Kim mentioned the survey. So we conducted a survey to ask park visitors, how they found out about the park. Did they know why the goats were there? Were they concerned about the park? About the goats? So just a bunch of general information. And through those conversations, we encouraged people to use a citizen science tool like iNaturalist to report when they were seeing goats and to take pictures. Because remember I had said that we suspect there's about 25 to 30 goats in the population. Well, we only collared 6. So we still wanted to engage the public and get as much information as we could. And we were continually monitoring through this whole process. And then so to complement all this other stuff we were doing, in 2022, Kim had the brilliant idea for us to install a diversionary lick. And this is because Kim had success with this on another project. And even with Kim will show you some photos in a few minutes of our collar data. So you could see after we collared the goats where they were moving around to, we decided we wanted to try this opportunity of putting in a diversionary lick. So this is Senior Park Ranger Jordan, Austin, and I digging in a lick. And then the picture over there is wildlife biologists Andrew and TJ from the ministry and Kim digging in the salt. And we really dig it into the soil so that the goats have to work for it. They don't just get to go there and lick it all up. And that salt is typical livestock salt. So it's a combination of salt and minerals. And these 2 sites are actually very close together, like 100 meters apart. 50 meters apart. They're very close. And we did that specifically because if one nanny is really dominant, we wanted to make sure there was another opportunity very nearby for the other goats. And we had a lot of criteria for putting these things in. So one of the criteria was that we wanted it to be not too far from the campground so that we could hike over and access it, because you need to replenish the salt, at least in the summer, but a couple times a year. And so we had access to the cameras, the camera batteries, checking those things. We also wanted to make sure it was in a part of the park. So this is northwest of the campground. And we wanted to make sure that it was in an area that people don't typically go. We also wanted to make sure that it was located right adjacent to escape terrain. Because remember, we told you we had that one bear that got attacked by a grizzly. One goat that got attacked by a grizzly. So we wanted to make sure the goats had adjacent escape terrain right nearby. And then that's retired area supervisor Dave Heggie standing next to the wildlife camera. So there's wildlife cameras looking at both licks. because we've only collared 6 out of the population, it takes 280,000 photos we've got so far.
Over 3 years.
Over 3 years. And Kim's looked at every single one of those, if you can believe it. So.
That's why I wear glasses. The radio collars were extremely interesting because, as Amanda mentioned, it did give us an idea where these animals moved. This is the different colors are different animals. You can see that there's a large focus on the actual campsite shown with the camp symbol. This is a summering area, and the animals generally used most of that front range, if you want to call it that, during this late spring through early fall. We found that the nannies would tend to just bail over to the north into Mulvey Basin, and then slowly move down and generally winter down here in some of the winter range that I was describing, just down into the edge of tree line. Keeping in mind we only had 2 billies collared, but they often wintered here as well, but they occasionally tended to bail over into the next drainage up, Gwellum drainage. So these radio collars also gave us an independent snapshot of what the animals were doing in relation to the campsite and the diversionary licks that we put in. Yeah. A small scattering of the 280,000 images. They were actually really fun to go through. We saw a lot of interesting behaviors, the dominance, the rubbing, the bedding. You think the males, they're about 30 to 40% bigger than the nannies, but they can't hold a candle to a pissed off nanny who says, get out of here, and these big boys just scatter instantly. So that was a lot of fun. The one thing that was interesting, I'll show where the licks are in a slide or two, but we've had now 3 high elevation licks, I can call them. We haven't had a single other ungulate, no mule deer, no elk, no anything else at these sites, and we've never had a predator bigger than a long-tailed weasel at any of these sites as well. So I think that's good. There's a lot of worry. There is some worry with people about putting in diversionary licks where too much wildlife is congregating in one area, and then you can have disease transmission, things like that. So that doesn't seem to be an issue. The nice thing too was that we were lucky enough or smart enough to put cattle tags on the collars. So when we got images of animals in the cameras, we could often, actually about 90 to 95% of the time, tell who it was, which nanny it was and which billy. And that gave us a chance to come up with a reasonable estimate, a minimum estimate of the number of animals using those sites, because there was both collared, of course, and non-collared animals that were using them. So I'm going to go through a series of hopefully not too complicated figures just to show what the impact of putting the diversionary lick has been. This is each of these dots, the different colors are different animals. This is the nannies only. The campsite is obvious here with a 150-meter radius circle around it. Gimli Peak is right there. This is about 650 meters. And keeping in mind, this is 2021, this lick site is not in place yet. So you can see that there's very, very heavy use by the nannies of the campsite, almost no use of the future lick site area, and then a scattering of climbers and things like that. And then just changing into what's called a heat map. This is a depiction of the concentration of the locations of the animals. So what we've done here is this is nannies only, and this is only July, just to kind of standardize it. So you can see that in 2021, very high use of the campsite area, and then just a scattering of different animals moving in different areas. In July of 2022, again, very concentrated use of the campsite. The licks, these 2 licks here did go in, but they went in fairly late in July, so took a little bit of a time for the animals. Actually, it didn't take much time, but the animals took at least a few hours to discover the lick sites. Down here, you can see there was a lick we put in the second year. It didn't work out so well, so we pulled it. And we're going to talk about this lick that was put in this year as well. But to continue on, you can see the dramatic change in 2023. This was the first full year that the licks were in place, and the use by the nannies has shifted from almost total use of the campsite area to total use of the lick site area. The same pattern held in 2024, a little bit more scattered, which I think is related to the snow melt. 2023, if you recall, was a very early spring, and so the snow came off the lick sites we had put in early, so the animals could get at them. This year, well, it was felt like a late spring, but it was actually more of a normal spring. But in late June and early July, there was still a lot of snow on these, so it took a while for them to melt out. That's why the animals are kind of more scattered. The billies, being males, were a little bit slower on the uptake, keeping in mind there is only 2 of them. But throughout the 4 years, again, this is July only, throughout the 4 years of monitoring, the animals did concentrate on the campsite quite a bit. The pictures on the left are from one of the animals, and 2 years ago he broke his horn, so he was quite recognizable, telling which it was even without the collar. He's actually 11 years old, which is starting to push it for a mountain goat. Maybe 13, 14 is about the maximum. So I got a feeling he was just kind of lazy. He wanted to hang around the campsite and try and get a salt source there. So he never discovered the salt licks. The other male didn't at the beginning, but then all of a sudden he got a whiff of one and changed his movements, especially did a little bit more movement over into the lick site in 2024.
So you can see from the heat maps that Kim was just showing that we did end up installing one more diversionary lick to the northeast of the campsite. And that was, we did that just this summer. Another thing we did in 2024 this year was we installed a salt locker. So we've got kind of just this metal locker bin up there because we do have to fly up there with a helicopter to bring material and supplies. So we thought if we had a salt locker up there, it would make it easier for our staff to go up and replenish the licks and check on cameras and things like that. And at the end of August, our collars were pre-programmed to drop off, and we were able to retrieve them 10 days later. We got all 6 back, which is pretty incredible. The accuracy was really good. Kim went in with the rangers 10 days later and grabbed them all, which is awesome. Another thing that we were able to do with our collar data in 2024 was hunting is an opportunity that's allowable in Valhalla Park it's a limited entry hunting opportunity for mountain goats. And we were able to, there is a exclusion zone as part of that LEH hunt over the campground. We were able to expand it and make it bigger because of where we had seen that the goats had gone and at what time of year. And, we recognized that the diversionary licks, they're an interim kind of Band-Aid solution. We know that, but remember, we are trying to mitigate a human-caused issue. So we're really essentially giving the goats a higher quality source of what they seek. And this salt conditioning has developed over 20 years. So it's going to take more than a couple years to break this cycle. And so even though the collars have come off, this project is nowhere near its end. We're going to continue working on it. We've got next steps that are still up for discussion. Like I was saying, it's going to take more than a couple years to break that maternal-kid learning cycle. So the goats, sorry, I just lost my place here, pardon me. We just need to alter the goat behavior so that it does not continue to get passed down over generations and generations and generations. And we need to continue to educate our park visitors so that they can adapt their behavior while recreating in the park as well. And we have discussed quite a few other management options, but lots of those are really challenging or they're really expensive. And they come with both increased risks to humans and goats. So this project is still, we've been working on it for 4 years, but we've got a lot left to do here.
Just to touch briefly on Cathedral Provincial Park, again, it's in the South Okanagan off of Karamias. They have issues with mountain goats in and amongst the campsites again as well. That's a picture on the left there. Back in 2018, BC Parks, mostly Kurt Safford, started a project. He had students, Aurora Wildlife on board, and also Thompson Rivers University doing surveys. And those are the same surveys that detected, despite a lot of knowledge and outreach, and people kind of know what the issue is, there's still 35% non-compliance. So Laura, in her thesis, recommended that the managers try and manage the human urine issue, and that's mainly through education. Signage is one, and they're also establishing more outhouses. She also recommended that they do try diversionary licks. Especially these animals are up on the ridge lines a lot, and they come down into the campsite, and she was suggesting that a diversionary lick might head them off before they hit the campsite. Kirk gave me a bit of an update this spring and said that they haven't gone the diversionary lick route. They're trying to manage the situation without going there. So he says they're working on the public education. They're building more facilities to try and encourage people to use them for compliance. He says there's still about the same number of goats in the campsite. They're a little less pushy than they used to be. And actually some of the more high aggression examples that we've seen in BC have come from that area. So they got hit, I don't know if you recall, but that area got hit by a wildfire 2 years ago. It kind of put a bit of a crimp in their system. So they had to recover from that. He did tell me one anecdote. So there's the campsite for those that have been there, and across the lake is a private lodge. And the lodge is well aware of all the goat issues, and they've had some of the major problems. But this spring, maybe it was just an oopsie, but they actually put salt on their deck and on their walkways, probably for human safety. It was icy. And of course, what happened? They had mountain goats up on their deck. So you can see that these animals are still driven to get salt no matter where it comes from. All right, so we've been dealing a lot with summer. Gimli, of course, is more of a summer issue. Mountain goats in winter, their forage availability is very limited, of course. Their home range size is reduced. They can spend a lot of energy pushing through snow. Winter is basically a starvation time. They don't have enough resources to get through the summer or get through the winter at the same weight. So they're basically on a managed starvation just to make sure they are alive at the end of winter so they can hit the new forage and come back. Winter range in the Kootenays differs a fair bit. In the Rockies, where the snow is generally lighter and drier, they're often up on the cliffs or on windswept south-facing slopes adjacent to escape terrain. Whereas in the Purcells, and especially in the West Kootenays, the snow is deeper and it's wetter. And these animals tend to come down into the top end of tree line in amongst the cliffs where the snow is being shed a bit, and they can use that for getting it forage underneath the trees, or in fact, eating the balsam fir. It's pretty lousy food, but it's survival food. This fairly crappy picture in the bottom right is from my first winter here. I arrived in the winter of 96, 97, and for those that remember that was the 50-year snowfall. Coming from Yellowknife, where a big snowfall is 3 inches, to this, what we got that winter was absolutely stunning. We were doing surveys, and it looked like some of these animals in the Slocan were tucked into literally 1 hectare for weeks on end. They had nowhere to go, so they were just trying to make it through. Of course, mortality is generally higher in winter because of starvation and other things, but what we also see is mortality from avalanches. Now, the Alaskans, who do things generally quite big, have collared hundreds and hundreds of goats, and they looked at the survival of these goats over the winters and found that avalanches were killing a lot of goats, and in some areas and some years, depending on the snowpack, it was a very high mortality. Our avalanche mortality is probably not that high. We have different snow, but it does occur. And I know of an example where 15 goats were killed in an avalanche in Abbey Ridge in the Elk Valley only a few springs ago.
So like Kim was saying, the winter time is really, really challenging for goats. And so backcountry skiing can bring skiers adjacent to wintering mountain goats and can make them flee into some pretty scary terrain. So we're just going to show you a quick video here that was filmed in Smithers. This is just on YouTube. So if anyone wants to search it up, you can watch the full thing, but we're just going to show you a quick 30 seconds here.
All the goats flee the skiers and head downhill. This herd has been subjected to frequent displacement by skiers, snowmobilers, and snowshoers for over a decade, and the goats move away immediately. This is the path the goats follow to get away from the skiers. The snow is 150 to 200 centimeters deep, and the slope ranges from 30 to 60 degrees. Avalanches can trigger on a 35-degree slope, so this path is very high risk.
So yeah, that video is just over 9 minutes long, and if you search up McKendrick Report 7, January 15th, 2023, you'll be able to find it. Okay, so the other thing that kind of impacts goats in the winter, or that does impact goats in the winter, can be helicopter-supported recreation. And studies have shown that goats exhibit increased movement in the 48 hours following helicopter disturbance, and then they move closer to escape terrain. So you would think the majority of the impact would happen as a helicopter flies by, but actually the studies have shown it's after that time period. And helicopter-supported recreation activities should avoid wintering area by 1.5 to 2 kilometers. And heli operators should be well aware of this. It's in the tourism guidelines for anyone who's operating commercially. So what can you do? Here we are, this part of the presentation. So you can educate yourself, which is what you're doing this evening. You can learn and share your knowledge. This video is going to be posted on the YouTube channel for WildSite and on the website, so feel free to share it. We've talked about a lot of different studies and things this evening, so feel free to look up some papers and educate yourself and be an advocate for wildlife. And WildSite is the poster child in our area of doing exactly that. And read and understand all posted information when you go into an area. Land managers spend a ton of time trying to get our words just right and trying to make our signs appealing so people will read them. So please take the extra time and care to do that. We talked quite a bit about the use of facilities, and please use those facilities, especially at night too. And if there is no facilities where you are, if you can move well off of the trail and practice no trace ethics, that's a great idea too. Avoid approaching wildlife always. Everyone knows that, right? Avoid approaching mountain goats. And in the wintertime, they're in some pretty gnarly terrain. But if you are in areas where you know that there's goats wintering in the winter, good to avoid those areas just so you don't push them into tricky terrain that could potentially have a risk of avalanche. That's challenging in Valhalla and at Cathedral, though, because the goats are going to approach you. So in that scenario, what you need to do if they come closer than 50 meters, just yell and clap your hands, the same thing you would do if you saw a bear at that close range. No need to throw rocks or poke them with a ski pole. Just yelling and clapping your hands is sufficient. And another thing in the case of Valhalla or Gimli, and Cathedral, you can always choose another location for your adventure. We're so blessed in the Kootenays. There's so many recreational opportunities all over the place. If you know of these issues, these habituation issues, go somewhere else. There's so many great places we get to go. Another good thing to do is to leave your dog at home. There's lots of places you can take dogs, but there's lots of places that dogs are not the best thing to bring along with you. And if you can report sightings, reporting sightings is so helpful to those of us who are trying to collect this data. Best places are iNaturalist or the BC Parks website. There's a general mailbox on there too that you can send information to, or you can send it to Kim and I, and there's our email addresses. And we would love to answer any questions that you may have. And we've got BC Park stickers for anyone who wants to ask us questions.